The going was slow and tough as the winter of 1944 approached in Europe. The weather was turning bad, reducing and in some cases eliminating the Allied air superiority advantage. German ground forces were pressed back against and inside the borders of the fatherland. The way it was going, it wouldn't be long before the homes and streets they would be defending would be their own. Allied forces were tired by the pace and pressure of rapid advance, but as they fought forward house by house and town by town, they were buoyed by rumors from home and higher headquarters the war could be over by Christmas. In the meantime, the young men who had begun streaming ashore on Fortress Europe on D-Day were becoming combat veterans and combat casualties. For those who lived, it was an experience they would never forget. For some, an experience they would return to remember. Because in war, death is a fact of life, and after war, memories of life and death, private grief and fear, and shared triumph and laughter become the living historical record of men of war.
My mission was to hold to the end. That was the last word I got from Commander. I said, the end. He said, yeah, well, yeah, I'm sorry, but that's the way it's got to be. We've got to get this stuff off from behind you. So I knew then that I had to stay till I didn't have nothing left.
I observed the road jammed with vehicles and personnel and weapons, and it just looked like a July 4th parade coming down. The fire that was delivered on that stretch of road for about 2 hours was what looked like a whole division artillery firing everything they had. There were horses flying around and wheels and men and everything else. That was the high point and the most terrifying sight I've ever seen.
While I was standing there, I heard a vehicle coming up from the direction of the American lines. So I thought, hey, I wonder if we've been liberated, so to speak. I see a 3/4-ton truck of ours coming, and it's got 109th Infantry on it. So I really thought, hey, we're free. It got right on me, and it was full of German soldiers. And they all waved at me and thumbed their noses at me. And I was so shocked I didn't get a chance to respond. So they just went right on back, going toward Germany. But I had a feeling then we were in bad shape.
The German colonel, who only spoke German, asked the German sergeant who we'd held hostage and arrested prisoner, what was the treatment? Well, the sergeant says, they didn't mistreat us, they fed us good, they took care of our wounded, and they also protected us within the chateau so that we wouldn't be under our own fire, you know. And then the colonel comes out in perfect English. He says, you men are so lucky. He says, my intention was to shoot all of you for my dead comrades laying strewn through the courtyard.
I found a man looking up. I hear help, help, and I look down and I see eyeglasses from the flares, you know, and there's a man there hanging on the cliff. He's hanging there from the roots. He said, help! I says, what the hell are you doing? He says, get me out of here, I'm hanging. I said, Johnny, hold my belt. And I reached over and I picked Woody up. That's all I know him about, Woody.
I found this here probably about 10 years or so ago. You know, as you get older, you kind of forget a little bit. But this is actually my foxhole with my buddy. This was a double when we were cold.
So this area right here is actually where you were dug in on December 16th.
Yeah, you see you're stepping in that soft, it's still there, yeah.
Bob Pocklington and the other 28th Infantry Division Battle of the Bulge veterans were recalling the battle as they revisited the scene more than 40 years later. Their recollections provide vital information for military historians trying to add to, correct, and verify the record.
One of the things that makes it most difficult is that there was almost no, in my opinion, there was almost no post-combat interviews conducted within the 28th Division. So it makes it very, very difficult. And SLA Marshall once, I was in his presence once, and he was commenting that as soon as the fighting stops, the first item of resupply ought to be the historian.
In this case, it was to be 1988 for a group of veterans, including Richard Leach, to return to the ground where they fought, to tell the stories only they could tell. Leach was one of 14 veterans of the 28th Infantry Keystone Division to return to Luxembourg to revisit where they fought, to honor fallen comrades at the cemetery at Ham, and to recognize fallen opponents buried in a separate cemetery nearby. In 1944, these men were living in field conditions on the front line, fighting and hoping the war was near an end. Richard Leach's 8mm camera was with him, as it had been since 1942 when he filmed these never-before-shown pictures of the division training in Louisiana. The camera and the 28th Division's distinctive red keystone patch were in England as the division prepared for the expected attack on the continent. It was a time to capture the faces of men soon to become men of war. The 28th Division wasn't part of the D-Day landings, but 5 weeks later it was racing toward Paris through shattered French towns. Greeted and cheered on by the liberated victims of German occupation. The crowds got larger as they neared Paris, and the men of the division would make their famous march down the Champs-Élysées, with Leach recording the scenes from the back of a Jeep. The next day, the division was fighting forward as rearguard German units protected armies reeling in retreat, leaving the way littered with dead soldiers and destroyed equipment. The 28th Division became part of the rapid advance through France and Belgium and then on to Luxembourg as the German armies fell back on the strongly fortified Siegfried Line positions inside their own border. On the way, the men of the 28th helped to liberate Luxembourg after nearly 5 years of German occupation. The people of Luxembourg have never forgotten what happened in September of 1944. These photos show the liberation of the town of Osweiler. In 1988, the people of the town used a visit by veteran Richard Leach of the division's 109th Regiment to recreate and to re-celebrate the moment of liberation. It didn't matter to the people of Osweiler that Leach was not one of the soldiers in the original picture, but it did matter that all of the women in the recreation had been among the girls who first greeted the men of the 28th.
That was the liberation by the American soldiers, and after 5 years, nearly 5 years of Nazi oppression, this was a very big enjoyment for everybody in order to get free from the oppression and from the Nazi terror.
Leach didn't get to fight in the Battle of the Bulge. He had been wounded 6 weeks earlier in the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest as the Allies first tried to push into Germany.
We approached from the Aachen direction into the Hurtgen Forest and got up as far as Germeter, and it was pretty well destroyed, pretty well defended. Voschneck, Schmidt, and so on. Had some terrible battles there. The whole division was badly decimated. We'd come through a forest and our troops were pretty badly scrambled, our front line companies. And as we came out of the forest, Germans threw some terrible barrages and tree bursts, got a lot of our men right there, including me.
Other veterans recalled the horror and toll of the Hurtgen.
Really bad. I'd say we'd had more casualties at the Hurtgen than we probably had in the Battle of the Bulge. We had heavy casualties. And that was the reason that they brought us down here.
We lost men so fast, mostly we lost officers quick.
Mm-hmm.
There were some times we operated 3 days with no officers. There's other times we'd operate maybe a day without officers. Then we get new ones coming in.
It was to rest, refit, and take on replacements that the 28th Division was sent into a quiet part of the line facing Germany. The addition of thousands of replacements for the men killed, wounded, and captured and missing in the Hurtgen completed the transition of the division from the National Guard division it had been to an Army division. The highest Allied commands were feeling the Germans had lost the means and the will to fight, and maybe the war would soon be over. Hitler had other ideas. There is evidence that as early as July 31st of 1944, Hitler was already hinting at a large-scale offensive to break the Allied coalition and to relieve pressure on the homeland. In August and September, a small circle of officers was drawn into the process of planning the offensive, first timed for November and later delayed until December. It was to be a grand stroke, a maximum effort.
The big plan centered around an idea that Hitler had that the Allied alliance was weak, and that if he could put enough pressure on it that it would come apart. His plan strategically was to physically drive a wedge between the British and the Americans, and to capture the port of Antwerp, which was very, very important to the Allied effort. So he mustered all the reserves he could find, and he put together basically 3 armies. The 6th Panzer Army to our north, the 5th Panzer Army was to come through this part and support the 6th SS Panzer Army. And the 7th Army to our south, which was the weakest of those, was basically to hold the southern shoulder. We had taken, as Bradley mentioned several times, a calculated risk here in the Ardennes, and we used the Ardennes to blood new divisions and to give old divisions who had been in combat a long time an opportunity to rest, refit, and do some training. And that's what was going on here.
Secrecy was absolute. Officers were taken into confidence on an oath of death. While the Allies probed, rested, and refitted, the German army was mustering hundreds of trainloads of supplies, hundreds of thousands of men, and an arsenal of armor and artillery, all made possible because German war production under Albert Speer actually peaked in the fall of 1944. German field commanders tried to dissuade Hitler from the grand solution objective of driving to Antwerp, but Hitler was emphatic. The grand solution would be planned and executed. But as a practical matter, in October and November, most of the actual field-level planning concentrated on more limited objectives and more limited resources than Hitler promised. Still, by mid-December, Germany had marshaled almost 600,000 men, including 22 of the 32 divisions promised by Hitler, aimed at what was a soft spot in the Allied line. Militarily, this was a soft spot because the defensive line was stretched so thinly. The 28th Division occupied a 26-mile front, more than 3 times what a division would normally defend. To the north, near Uren, was the 112th Regimental Combat Team, commanded by Colonel Guston Nelson. Part of its line was on the German side of the Our River. In the center, stretched most thinly, were 2 battalions of the 110th Regimental Combat Team, commanded by Colonel Hurley Fuller. Its positions were widely separated strongpoints along the hilltop road paralleling the border known as Skyline Drive. Marnock and Hosingen were among the defended key road junctions. To the south, the 109th Regimental Combat Team, headquartered at Diekirch, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder, had forward positions near Furen and Vianden. The division headquarters of Major General Norman Dutch Cotta were located at Wiltz. His forces were defending an area that had been anything but a soft spot for more than 2,000 years. The area was part of the Ardennes, once unbroken heavy forest, now forest broken by rich fields, divided by streams and small rivers, with deep valleys. The area is marked by prosperous villages and towns. But most of all, it is an area crossed by a network of roads vital to attacking armies since the time of Julius Caesar. Since then, on the average of every second generation for 2,000 years, the Ardennes had been invaded or occupied. Some of the armies passed through, others stayed. All left their mark on the people and the land. In September of 1944, occupying forces had been driven out. In December of 1944, a massive and carefully planned campaign was about to begin in the Ardennes. The stage was set for what the world would come to know as the Battle of the Bulge.
The day before, and maybe on Thursday, our observers, like Lieutenant Katz, reported to us that across the river there was a lot of saluting. The Germans at the OPs and so forth that they were watching were saluting each other. And you don't salute in the front lines, they don't and we don't. So we knew something was going on, and we reported this on up to division and on up to corps. And it was the first clue that we had that something was happening in this area. We thought at least they were changing divisions, something like that.
When I finished my job here, which was somewhere around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I started back in my Jeep with my radio operator and driver, back hoping to drop them off in Deekirk and for me to continue on to attend this party that I had scheduled where I had a date with a Red Cross girl. Now, before we got to Furin, we drew some machine gun fire and got off the road and out of observation, and there was another Jeep behind us with 3 soldiers in it. They followed me. When the firing ceased, and I gave one of the soldiers a note and said, why don't you get back and report what had happened, I'll hang in here. And by the way, give this note to a girl named Marion Connolly, who's with the Red Cross in Edelbrook, if you will, and tell her I'll be about 15 minutes late. They then took off, and I had my radio operator and driver bring some fire on that general area from the right and the center. I headed around to the left and just threw a grenade in the general direction, and 3 Germans came out with their hands up. Didn't fire any more shots and would just seem to be relieved to come with us. I piled them in the Jeep, started back to Deekirk, dropped the Germans and the driver and radio operator off, and continued on my way to Edelbrook.
Little did you know that what you'd just been involved in was one of the first skirmishes of the Battle of the Bulge.
Had absolutely no idea. I figured these guys got lost.
Well, the night of the 15th of December, another soldier and myself were sent out to reconnoiter the town, which we did each evening, trying to pick up bits of information, etc. Because the town, I was with the intelligence reconnaissance, so we knew there were sympathizers here, and we thought through bits of conversation we could find out if anything was going to develop in this area. So we no sooner got downtown, there was 2 or 3 shells dropped in, and of course we said to ourselves, hey, our artillery goofed up again, they're shelling us again. And then there was a period maybe of 10 minutes or so, no shelling, then 2 more shells dropped in. Then he said, well, the damn fools made another mistake. And that was the rest of the shelling that night.
In a very real sense, the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge was seen from this observation tower in the town of Hosingen. A lookout posted at the top was looking to the east through his binoculars, and he was just about to deliver the customary report that nothing was happening when right before his very eyes, everything began to happen all at once.
At that time, we were going to have an awards and decoration ceremony that morning, the 16th, right up there in the town square. However, after the first shell came in, which sporadic firing, we don't particularly worry about one shell coming in, but it happened to hit the hotel down the street here, where our headquarters company was. And of course it set it on fire. But at that point, we didn't think it was too serious, so we were going to go ahead with the awards and decoration ceremony. But in an hour or so, we realized, the colonel apparently realized it was a little more serious. So he had me personally go up and direct the companies back to their quarters, back to where they were billeted, and get their arms and so forth, because they were going to be committed out of the reserve.
Early in the forenoon of the 16th, my ration sergeant was coming from the division area, and he habitually rode the first truck of the ration train. In front of that building up there, he literally bolted out of the front seat and said to me, I was on the opposite street corner, "What is going on, Major? Men are coming back across the fields with their blankets over one arm and their rifles slung loosely over the other." I said, "I do not know." Within 5 minutes after that, Colonel Rudder, regimental commander, summoned me to the regimental headquarters, which was perhaps a half block up the street toward Dekirch, and informed me of the following: there appears to be a breakthrough along our front. I want you to take immediate steps to secure all necessary supplies and equipment, particularly gasoline and ammunition. I would say that this was perhaps 9 o'clock in the forenoon of the 16th.
Well, as I say, I came up here on the morning of the 16th. All day, they just went straight through, the Germans did. And we did lots of firing. And the men were located in houses just outside of this. This was the most prominent house in this town of Furin. And the company headquarters were here. And so the headquarters were here, but we fired artillery from here, calling into the 107th Field Artillery, and fired lots of missions all across, because the Germans just came through and we could see them plain as day. And all that day we did that. That night, it quieted down. So during the night, we were kind of wondering what was going to, and of course we were hoping they were going to say, pull out of E Company, pull E Company back. But that was never the case. The orders were to hold at all costs.
The elements of 4 German divisions hit the 103rd Division, hit the 110th Regimental front. Well, it was winter time, and they came over with tanks and infantry. Crossed the Our River, came up. They only went about a quarter or a half mile, and all the strong points were in town.
Retired Lieutenant General Daniel Strickler began his military service as a Pennsylvania National Guardsman serving on the Mexican border in 1916. He was wounded and gassed as a 21-year-old lieutenant with the 28th Division in France during World War I. In World War II, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Strickler now confronted German soldiers again.
We killed off practically all of their infantry. We slaughtered their infantry, the infantry that were with the tanks and following the tanks. And when the tanks had to go through these crossroad towns, and there we brought up artillery. We put the artillery guns right up near the front line, firing directly down the roads at these tanks had to come down the roads.
I wanted to get to the CP where I could get communication with the company. I took my helmet off, put it under my arm. I was running across, Germans coming this way, I was running this way to the CP. I ran into a group of them, knocked 2 of them over, and they cussed and swore at me. They thought I was one of them that was careless. But I just kept running.
Now, what was it still dark at that point?
It was still dark.
All right.
Shortly after that, they put the lights on, and they shined them on the clouds. It got light as day. Well, then we could really knock a lot of them down. We had them as far as you could see. It was dotted all over with them because we had good fire. Well, like this.
When I got the word that the regiment was pulling out, I got into my Jeep and came up to the regimental CP, but there wasn't anybody here, so I immediately turned and went back to the rear area CP.
Did you realize at that moment you might have been the forward-most American soldier? You didn't like that idea?
I didn't realize it. It just happened to be that way. And of course I knew that there were platoons out ahead of me because the platoons were out there fighting. In fact, they were fighting to such an extent that they forced the Germans to separate, go on both sides of us. That day was all confusion because we lost communications when the CP pulled out, and nobody knew what was going on as far as we were concerned.
At the very last minute, we received information that we had the responsibility to load up and move out of this town inmates of an insane asylum, and I suspect that's it could have been made that the people therein could have been made up of elderly people. In any case, as I recall, most of them were able to walk. They came from somewhere in this direction, this end of town. But very suddenly, early that afternoon on the 19th, a locomotive with 3 passenger cars was backed in from the Luxembourg city area and was stopped. And as I recall, somewhere over there on perhaps the second tracks, the engineer and the fireman were very nervous. What looked very suspicious from early on was that they were very anxious to get back out of town. The regimental civil affairs officer attached to us, Major Stanton from Rochester, New York, was the civil affairs officer. He removed the engineer and the fireman, and as I recall, he put them in jail, or otherwise somehow he incarcerated them, and he commandeered a cook or two from these kitchens sitting on the platform, which by that time did not have too much to do, to keep up fire in the boiler and keep up steam. We then began the process of loading the inmates. We didn't know as much as we should have known about that operation. We would put them on a car and they would go to the other end of the car, to the far door, and get out of the car. It took quite a while to get the entourage pieced together, and it was just getting dark as I was out here, and I was somewhere, I suspect, over there in the vicinity of that clock now, watching that train leave. We had suddenly released the engineer and the fireman, and they had up steam thanks to us, and they took off. And I remember them going in that direction, and they were Heil Hitler, waving to us Heil Hitler as they departed this city. One of those things that you're never told about, that you have to be prepared for, that you look back with some humorous aspect. But we did. We did that.
The next thing we knew, we looked out there and there's a whole line of armored tanks. And they parked on that hillside from about the crown of the hill there to the bottom there, as you can see. And they, of course, they were firing point blank at us with their
direct fire right into the
direct fire. It was just like almost like eye level. And of course, as you can see, we call it a fortress. It's a chateau or a castle. The walls are very thick, so we were well protected. We couldn't answer because we were just armed with carbines and rifles. We felt that was a waste of ammunition firing against attack. But then after 1 or 2 barrages, the German tankers either got careless or overconfident. Some of them got out of their turrets and stood alongside their tanks, smoking cigarettes, drinking coffee. So right away we said, oh boy, this is ducks. So we whammed away at them. And when we fell a couple of them, all of a sudden the rest of them saw there was something remiss, so they got back into their tanks.
The tank come down here real slow, and it goes click-clock, click-clock. You can hear those boogie wheels like they do with the Germans.
Coming over the hill.
Coming right over the hill. And then what was strange was, these GIs was on there. I didn't know whether it was German or Americans. And they're laughing, they're joking, some are smoking cigarettes. So I laid back down my foxhole. I figured they had a guard up here and they had one over here, you know. Mm-hmm. And I said, oh, the hell with it, I'm going to get some sleep, because you don't get much sleep here.
It's coming down over the hill.
Coming down right down through this hollow. That tank came down here. It took maybe about, 10 minutes to come down here. And all at once, he made a left flank and stopped about 5 yards from my foxhole. And I didn't get up. My buddy stuck his head up because the vibration probably woke him up. And as he got up, there was 2 men, one in the back and one in the front, just went right down the row. There's foxholes here, all along here. And they just went down and machine gunned those guys.
The rest were all either killed, wounded, or
Well, they
captured.
had hand-to-hand combat here, and I heard a lot of moanings and groanings, and
PFC Bob Phillips was just on his way back to his unit when he and other recovered wounded and replacements became part of a hastily mounted counterattack.
They moved up the two companies, and then the battalion headquarters, and those all of us that were there moved up also by truck and up into the fringes of Royler someplace. And this is not a very large town, but up in there. And the companies launched their attack. The company was up in Marnack, and they were supposed to give them some support. I think it was the 2nd Panzer that was coming down the road. So they launched their attack, and they ran head into, apparently the 2nd Panzer was also, some of those units were launching their attack. And from what I gather, looking back over it now as a historian, they sort of ran into each other. And they had a little more firepower, I think, than the two companies did.
Now, how did the unit end up getting out of here? You were under a lot of pressure for 2 or 3 days. How did the unit, did it withdraw as a unit, or what happened?
I think we just scattered. So where they all went, I don't know. But when it ended up, there was 10 of us left.
And then I went into the regimental. By that time, nightfall was upon us. And all flares were all shooting up and the tanks were all flying, you know. And I went into the regimental and I didn't see anybody. And I said to Johnny, check that switchboard and see if there's operation yet. He did. And I got onto the line to the General Cota. And I told him who I was. I said, I'm Sergeant DeMaria from the 28th Signal Company. I said, this town is all kaput, General. I said, there's a Tiger tanks right outside the door ready to blow us apart. I said, so I got to get the hell out of here. He says, all right, try to get back to me. Report to me, he said. I says, I'll try. And then I destroyed the switchboard, and me and John went out to the back door and got up the ladder and took off into the back of this area here. And when I got up on top of the hill, I hear people scuffling around, and here I got them together, and I picked up 15 other men.
We did not have a continuous defensive line, but we had strong points. And that when the German attack took place, a lot of our strong points were isolated, so that some of those, I'm sure, ran out of ammunition. But ammunition was available, I would say, down to the battalions. And from there, it was up to the battalions to distribute it to the frontline units, and I'm sure there were many frontline units that were stranded that couldn't get their ammunition due to the fact that they were surrounded.
I thought if we can just save on ammunition till it gets dark, I'll send them out of here 2 at a time. We'll see if we can get out of here. But then they brought 3 tanks in, and troops behind the tanks. Well, we fired at them until we had nothing. By that time, they're from here to those trees. No, closer than that, I guess. The tanks drove up, right side by side. The motor shut off. Got real quiet. The whole battleground got quiet. And if you ever hear a tank gun come down, it hums. And this, I suppose, was to impress us. When the guns were level, a car drove up, officer crawled out, looked like he'd come out of the movies, shined boots. I had weird, dirty clothes. They already wanted to see the commander. Well, I walked out on rubber legs. Walked out and I saluted, he saluted. He said, give you 10 minutes. Pointed at the tank. He said, I'll give you 10 minutes. Put your guns down, come out like good boys. We'll give you home the rest of till the war ends. I come back in the house and I look at every man. He'd look at the floor. Nobody'd look at me. And I thought, no ammunition. Should we put bayonets on and take as many with us as we could? And I was standing there thinking, and I thought, no, that wouldn't be right. If they go to prison, maybe some can get home. So this officer said, I heard him holler some kind of minutes. I don't know, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, something. I don't know if he meant that's what I had left, that's what I used, but I started crying, and I smashed the glasses on this Dutch oven, and I said, put your hands on your heads and get out. So they lined us up, and they took our watches, rings. And an officer was standing talking to me. I think what he was trying to tell me was, get your men in their column of twos. They had them all lined up, see. There was a barn a little ways away. And the German had set the machine gun up. I saw him doing it. And he shot the first 3 men. If he'd have shot 5, he'd have got his own officer and me too.
That day then, they started closing in to isolate and take this place. And during the day, the men that were in other houses and small buildings around here gradually came back into this one building, so that I'd say by 4 or 5 o'clock, everybody that with E Company was in this set of buildings right here. Then they came down the road with a tank, I'd say just about dark, a Tiger tank, and they just wheeled it around right out here on this road and started shooting right into these buildings. And it just tore up walls, everything. There was hay in the top of the building over here. It all got on fire, and pretty soon the whole complex was burning hard, and they were shooting right into it. All the men of E Company and their company officers talked to me about it, and there wasn't anything that really could be done at that point. They could stay right here and all be killed with those 88 guns just shooting right through the building. So they walked out here on the road and gave up, and rightly so. But I thought I'd be smart and escape. So I stayed in this building, kind of hid for a while, and thought I could jump out here, and there was a row of trees out here on the back toward Germany, and that I could just jump into those trees and maybe have a way of trying to get away. So this is the advantage of always having a reconnaissance. I walked over to this kitchen window right here where I'm pointing, and I run it up and I jumped out. Right down here below is a cellar door, and I hit that and I went clear through to the base to the cellar. It could have killed me, you know, but it really shook me up. And but I got up and I ran across this yard out here to those trees, and there was like a hedge around that was a fence. And I crawled under that fence, and here was a young German soldier about 16 or 17 years old that had big horn-rimmed glasses, and he had a gun. He was kind of looking off to one side, and I crawled right up on top of him. And I laid a .45 pistol right behind his ear. I didn't want to shoot him because I wanted to get away from here. I wasn't trying to call any attention to myself. And he right away just threw his hands out, and in German I think he said, "Nix schießen, nix schießen." Just about then I looked up, and there was a German behind me. I would say must have been a basketball player. He must have been about 7'2". And he had the biggest gun I've ever seen in my life. Had a barrel about this big. And I learned German fast, and I said, "Nix schießen," and that's how I got captured, you know.
Or it was to hold the fort, you know, and we didn't even know what the objective was, you know, so we felt we'd do what we could, because we had limited firepower. We only had one bazooka with 2 rounds. Of course, when we expended that, then all we had like a couple of machine guns, you know, and M1s and pistols, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, after the damage was done by the tanks, of course, they just continued to rumble through town, you know. We could just hear them rumbling all night long. And then the next day, then they send in swarms of infantrymen. They come right up through that little thing there, like a frontal assault, you know. And there again, they were foolhardy because they had no choice, no chance. So I figured how many we killed, you know, quite a few of them. And then they would withdraw. And finally, the afternoon of the 18th, we were out of ammunition. The building was crumbled almost to the first floor. The whole chateau was afire, so we had no other choice, so we decided, well, we'll surrender. So then the question came, well, who's going to go out first? So I said, well, if nobody will go out, I'll go out first. Of course, we had these German prisoners. So I said, what we'll do is, I said, I'll take the prisoner in front of me first, and I'll be behind him, so if they fire, even if he jumps aside, then you'll know that the rest of you are going to be shot, you know. So I walked out behind the guy, and he stepped off, and they ordered me to stand up against the wall, and of course everybody else come out and surrendered.
But the full story of what the world has come to know as the Battle of the Bulge is not just a story of failed intelligence, of surprise and tactics and strategy. It's very much a story of isolated men and a story of isolated units. Units that fought on as long as they could, any way they could, and in the process, making all the difference in the world. Official after-action reports on both sides would clearly show that what had been believed to be a soft spot in the Allied line would become a nightmare of delay for the German plan. Those few hard-fought days allowed the surprised Allied forces to regroup and rush reinforcements to turn back the offensive.
We had practically eliminated most of their infantry when the Germans finally got back to Bastogne, you know. They circled Bastogne. They practically all tanks. Well, tanks can capture towns, but they can't hold them. And that's when they surrounded Bastogne. We were still out at Wiltz. And when I heard that, when the communications were, I heard that the 101st Airborne Division had landed, that's the only, what you might call, reserves that Eisenhower had, sent them up. A whole division holding Bastogne, and here we were with about 1/5 as many men holding Wiltz out front.
The record would clearly show the men of the 28th Division resisted until they no longer had the means to resist. The 112th Regiment forcing the Germans to take the longer, slower route around the road network in the northern end of the Skyline Drive. The 110th Regiment broken into pieces without headquarters command and control, pieces which held crucial road junctions in Hosingen and Marnock and Clairvaux for hours. Engineers fought as infantry, and headquarters elements made up of clerks, cooks, and bandsmen joined the fight, slowing the German advance. And the 109th Infantry Regiment stopping the entire German 352nd Volksgrenadier Division with a classic flank attack. And the troops were all on the top of the ridge?
On top of the ridge, or those certain other kinds of weapons, perhaps mortars, immediately behind on the reverse slope. It was ready-made, ready cut. It was a cold, crisp morning. There is a saying that you shouldn't get mad, you should get even. But these guys had had enough, and they did both. They were mad and they got even. This is General Erich Brandenberger's 7th Army. They were advancing along this axis that morning, headed west. Thought they had it made. Apparently, there were no advance guards. They were moving up here in mobs and bunches. In this column was horse-drawn artillery. Crew-served weapons on carts pulled by men. No attempt whatsoever for reconnaissance right and left. Wide open shot. There was really no place for them to go for cover. As you see, this is all wide open. And it was just a question of minor changes in range and fire adjustments that made that 30 minutes of combat so effective. The estimated German losses is casualties in the vicinity of 2,000.
We delayed them 2 days. The third day, I got out of here. I went back to the CP, and they was fighting there. And in fact, the railroad station, that's where our wounded went to. And I just contacted Bruce Matthews, the chaplain that was there. And he prayed for the injured, and the wounded got up and started to fight. Some didn't come back. They were either killed or captured. We were actually all marked off. The 110th was completely marked. And there's a telegram when I was missing in action on the 19th, and later, 3 months later, they said I was back on duty. Hell, I was still fighting the war.
It seems as though the frontline units who delayed the German drive for 4 days really made the big difference, because this gave all the reserve units time to get in place to counterattack the Germans and then be successful in closing off the Bulge. So I'm certain, and I've read everywhere, that these 4 days were extremely critical, because in the German timetable, they were supposed to come right through these lines and get right on up into Antwerp in a matter of 4 or 5 days. And we delayed them right here for those 4 or 5 days, so their timetable was completely disrupted.
The more evidence that I've dug up, the more work I've done, it just substantiates what we already found. That this was a very unique example. These men were told to hold at all costs, and they did exactly that. And because of that, they were able to have time to move the 101st up to Bastogne. Otherwise, there would have been no Bastogne.
The fight that these fellows made, the 28th and Division here, made up on Skyline Drive, absolutely threw the German timetable out the window. They couldn't, and they'll tell you that their writings tell you that the race to Bastogne was lost right here, and from that point on, they couldn't recoup. You had company commanders who were out of touch with some of their platoons. They were working with what they had. Platoon leaders that were isolated, who received the order to hold at all costs and believed it and did the best they could. And they used their own initiative. Without instructions from higher headquarters, they fought as hard as they could. And when they got driven off one position, they went to another one. They got into position, they waited, and when the Germans came up, they ambushed them. They used all the skill and tactics that infantry are supposed to have and know, and they exceeded everybody's expectations. It's almost unreal when you walk around this battlefield and look at what happened and read and talk to the veterans of this thing, that they were able to do it. And nobody would have ever have expected it. To me, it's a miracle.
We also bow our heads in gratitude to your country and the nation.
The people of Luxembourg have never forgotten what the liberation and re-liberation meant to the country. It was an effort revered by those too young to remember, and vividly recalled by those old enough to remember.
So it was the happiest day I remember during all the war, and even before the war. It was the happiest day I left, and my parents too. I can't tell you. We all was crying. We all cried.
You see, the Luxembourgers will not forget and never forget who has been the liberator of Luxembourg. That happened in the First World War already, and mainly in the Second, because the population had suffered much more in the Second World War from the, on the administrative point of view, and then the young boys were sent to the German army, people in concentration camp, and as I said, 1 Luxembourg out of 10 has been during those years in concentration camp, in jail, or suffered in some way. Nobody will also forget those American soldiers who came here, and really they were the friends right from the beginning, and they, I can say, they are still our friends, and I'm sure that they will be always.
My family from Maschenau was evacuated south. So what's going on in Maschenau? Well, they said the Germans came back. I said, are you crazy? I have seen them walk back from Normandy to Luxembourg. The German Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine walked back to Luxembourg. So there's a big thing going on. And of course, the 3rd day or 4th day, I saw the Stars and Stripes, German counterattack, the salient. They call it first the salient. It's now called the Bulge for the historical recollection of the operation. So then, of course, we were frightened and said, Jesus Christ, if these guys come back, they're going to shoot us all. I mean, I would have been proud to be shot for the cause because we belong, we were on your side. It never got to that extremity, and here I am, and I'm glad to be here. Now, you can't believe how proud I am to have been part of this operation.
Americans are for us the liberators which brought back liberty, simply liberty, where you can go where you want, read what you want, say what you want. And this is what we Luxembourgers still think when American people, especially soldiers from that very years come back. We think of them as bringing back our liberty to do and feel what we want.
And the initiative that we all take pride of, the American initiative, just jumped out in this operation. Leaders came forward that No one expected. Guys that never thought they would be in a position to have to make the decisions, life and death decisions, came out and made those decisions, and the rest followed, and they got the job done. And had these guys not just filled these hills with mean folks just tearing the Germans up, that would have never happened. The Germans would have gone through us. Thin crust would have been busted.
So as we look back through the time and what the historians call the fog, which inevitably shrouds the great mortal conflicts of the past, we now find monuments standing where men once fought and fell, but we still find painful, lingering, and real emotion linking those who lived with those who fell.
You can be scared, and as long as you're still doing your job, you're all right. And this is what we were doing most of the time. The low points were when people were killed. Sergeant Strawbridge, who was our FDC sergeant, was killed back at our CP in artillery fire, and I've always regretted that. He was doing something that I could have been doing. I happened to be up here because we had a German battery a couple, 2,000 meters over here that we were firing at with Charge 1, which is artillery vernacular for short range. But Sergeant Strawbridge was out checking the local defenses, and he was killed in the process, and it's one of the kind of things you're really sorry about.
I think a low point would be when, like when we got the order to hold at all costs. I think that's a chilling order to any man that's on in the line or any place nearby that says, they say hold at all costs. That seems, you get the idea that you're sort of expendable at that point.
And when we got near the town of Bulge, all hell broke out, flares went up, guns were going, yelling and carrying, and they thought we were Germans. They were shooting us, and we were only Canada, and they were shooting at us. And before we knew it, we were all captured by Americans. Oh, they said, we got a colonel here. I said, yeah. Who are you? I said, I'm Colonel Strickler, 110th Infantry Commander. 110th? He said, we thought you were all wiped out. And I said, hell no. And he took me into the little town in the building, and by God, there was 28th Division Headquarters. General Cota, General Davis, Assistant Division Commander with the summary staff. They were kicked out of Seabray, and they established a new headquarters at Faux Reserves. Cota said, Strickler. Well, I said, hell, we thought you were dead. He said, you were reported missing in action 2 days ago. And he put his arms around me, and I said, we're certainly glad to see you. And well, having been fighting day and night without any food or water for 3-4 days, I slumped down on the floor and went to sleep.
My ammunition convoy was coming in with 7 truckloads of ammunition, mortars, and small arms, small caliber ammunition, and advised the warrant officer, States, Ralph B. States was his name, advised him that we had just been fired on coming back and that he would never make it. He didn't have to get that ammunition up there. He says, you got to get it up there. He says, there's nobody up there to use it. And you never make it. But I never knew such a conscientious man, and he had his orders from the regimental supply officer to get the ammunition in. And that's what he was doing, and now I've lost a good buddy. He went forward and didn't make it.
And that whole convoy never made it?
That whole convoy, I never saw or heard of anything about them anymore after that.
And he's buried?
He's buried in Liège, Belgium right now. I got the name of the cemetery to take back to give to his sister who lives in my hometown. And I wanted to show that to her because I know she would be happy to know about it.
We got hit with an 88 Flowers, which was our transportation sergeant. He got killed, one other guy got his leg off, and I was lucky enough to just get hit in the arm. But Sergeant Flowers, he was the best buddy I had, you know.
Then I come to the worst part. I had a guy right near Corporal Green. I had picked up a telegram the night before. I didn't know what it was then. I looked at it after I was captured. The telegram said his wife would give birth to a little boy. Never got it. I forgot about it in the excitement. Now he's dead. All this time I wondered, could I have got it to him somehow? That kid's 44 years old. Never saw his father. All I know is that he was Corporal Green from Illinois, and I don't know the town. And I wish to God I did.